going to make a start. So welcome to our final critical conversation of SLF 2021. But I'm sure that it is far from our final critical conversation in education. I'm sure it is just the beginning. And the engagement and the feedback suggests that this is an important start that we've made and that these conversations need to continue and that there is a desire for these conversations to continue as well. I'm Sarah. I'm delighted to have been invited to host these three conversations. I can't believe it's the last one already, and I know how quickly the hour goes, so I'm sure we're in for another fast-paced hour tonight. So for me as a psychologist, as a coach, I've worked across the education system, both nationally and locally, but I am independent of our key organisations. And so being able to host these conversations has been a real pleasure for me, and it's been great to connect with so many different perspectives and voices over these 3 nights. I've always been an advocate of the power of conversation, and if ever there was a time to be brave in our conversations, then I guess that time is now, and we have started to see that over the course of the last 3 nights. We've enjoyed really honest, connected and challenging conversations. We started with the curriculum. We then moved on into empowerment, and tonight we're focusing on leadership, and I'm sure we are in for another connected, honest and challenging conversation as well. To those of you who are joining us from home or from school or perhaps from other parts of the world beyond Scotland, a big welcome. I know we're reaching towards the end of the week. It's probably been, if you've been engaging in the SLF, you've probably consumed a lot over the last 3 days and engaged a lot. So we're delighted that you're here tonight with us. I'm also aware it's tea time, so there's probably lots going on for you around you. And also that for some of you, you're going into a long weekend as well. So you definitely get double points for turning up tonight and joining us. So thank you. Please do feel free to use the chat. We're well used to, after 18 months of using Teams and Zoom, we know how the chat works, but it's a great tool for us here to get a sense of how you are thinking and feeling and reacting to the conversation. Please use it to share your thoughts, to challenge us, to ask questions, to just share your reactions to this. You can also like and love other people's comments as well. So again, it's another great way for us to get a sense of the shared feeling or the collective feeling and thoughts in the room as well. So my first job is to introduce my colleagues here with me tonight. So I'm going to start with that. I also noticed that we seem to have lost Khadija. So I'm not sure if she is still here, but hopefully she'll make it back in if she has had to drop out. She was having technical difficulties earlier. So, and in no particular order, I'm going to introduce my colleagues tonight. So we have Jane Minnelli, who trained as a physics teacher, and Jane quickly became focused on working with children and young people with complex and multiple additional support needs, both in specialist residential and local authority schools. Her middle leadership experience was in an all-through ASN school in Ayrshire, and she's now head teacher of an ASN high school in Lanarkshire. And we're delighted that Jane has managed to join us here tonight. We also have Billy Burke. So Billy started out as a maths teacher and is currently head teacher at Renfrew High School. He's a member of the School Empowerment Steering Group and Professor Ken Muir's expert panel for the education reform. He contributes to leadership development and programmes at the University of Strathclyde, and he's also my co-host on our podcast, Changing Conversations. So today I get to ask him the questions, which is quite nice for a change. Lena Carter is currently a deputy head teacher with responsibility for pupil support. She's held a range of middle and senior leadership roles, including a recent secondment as the education lead for care experienced children and young people in Argyll and Bute. And that is a role that I know is close to her heart and to her values. She is a proud graduate of the Columba 1400 Head Teachers Leadership Academy, and she's also lead for Women Ed Scotland. Mark Andrew is a primary PT in East Lothian. He's currently teaching P2. He left school to study politics and hated it, Through different avenues, he found teaching because he knew he wanted to help people. And in his day-to-day teaching, he's interested in technology and the outdoors. But what keeps him going is the children and his colleagues in the professional networks like Twitter and podcasts. He gains hope from the knowledge and the courageous colleagues that he's connected with. And his 8-month-old daughter has brought a new perspective to life. And we may hear from his 8-month-old daughter as well. We also have Douglas. Douglas Hutchinson is Director of People and Deputy Chief Executive in South Ayrshire. He's also been Director of Educational Services, Head of Education, an Inspector and a Principal Educational Psychologist. Douglas originally trained as a teacher of RME and worked in various schools before taking up a post as a teacher in a residential school for young people with social, emotional and behavioural needs. Jillian Hamilton is Strategic Director with Education Scotland, where she has responsibility for professional learning and leadership and organisational development. Jillian is well known as the Chief Executive of SKEL when it first began back in 2014, and she's worked in education as a primary teacher, senior teacher, deputy head teacher, as well as other senior roles at GTCS, which I'm sure is not possible because she's far too young to have done all of that. We also have Marion Allison, who is Director of the CLD Standards Council Scotland, the professional body for people working and volunteering in adult learning, community development and youth work. And in this role, she works with those in the public, voluntary and private sectors with partnership programmes across the UK and beyond. And her doctoral research focused on young people, entrepreneurship and social networks. And she was telling us she's heading off to a festival this weekend as well. And Khadija, who hopefully will find her way back in at some point, is Programme Leader and Senior Fellow at the University of the West of Scotland. Her PhD centres on race equality, exploring the lived experiences of Black and minority ethnic teachers in Scotland, with a focus on celebrating their cultural, linguistic and religious identities. She's the co-founder and chair of SAMI, a community-led organisation providing support to educators and those in support and guidance roles across Scottish education. And Khadija is the first BME Muslim educator to be elected as the vice convener of the GTCS. Whew, that was a lot of you tonight. So welcome to everybody, and welcome again to all of those who have joined. So when I was thinking about this conversation tonight and thinking about this theme of leadership, I suppose what came to me is that it's happening all the time. It's all around us. It's everywhere. We really notice it when it's present, and we also notice its absence as well. And leadership isn't only about the role and position that we might hold. I also was thinking about the number of books that have probably been written on leadership, the number of models that exist that are leadership models. And I guess where I ended up was I had so many thoughts and questions that I just didn't know where to start. And so I guess I'm just genuinely really curious to see where this conversation takes us tonight, because I think it could take us in so many different directions. And I'm curious to see where that goes. But where I thought was a sensible place to perhaps start is recognising that we have had over the last 18 months and continue to experience significant disruption. We also know that reform is coming, and that we know that this is a huge opportunity. We have great potential here in this moment to create something different, something better. So I guess my question to get us started tonight is, what about the way that we're leading needs to change for future impact? So that might be skill set, it might be mindset, and it might be culture. But what needs to change for the future? And Douglas, it would be wonderful if you could start us off with some reflections and thoughts on that.
Thanks, Sarah. The first thing I would say is that reform is a permanent feature of education. Anybody that's been around for 10 minutes, it's just constant. And I suppose the question is, some of it's big major reform and some of it's smaller, so there's a question of scale. But in terms of mindset and skills, I think the first one is to be critical. I think we constantly need to be critical. I think as leaders, we have a duty to protect those that we lead, and as educators to protect children and young people from daft reform, because not all reform is good. It is a permanent feature, but it's not all good. We need to have a critical skills switched on. At the start, just before the start of the term, I was talking to the NQTs for South Ayrshire, and I was saying to them, to be a good teacher, you need to be constantly intellectually curious. And I think the same is true of us as leaders. We need those critical faculties because we've got a duty to those we lead. We've got a duty to children and young people. We need to constantly be intellectually curious and looking for the evidence. Where's the evidence for this particular reform? What's driving this reform? And as Graham Donaldson says, always be on the lookout for the snakeskin oil salesman. You know, so those are just a couple of random thoughts to start us off. Sarah, maybe somebody else wants to come in.
Thank you. I'm sure they're not random at all. In fact, they seem very coherent to me. But is there anybody who would like to respond to that, pick up on that, reflect on that? I'll come to Jane and then Lena. So Jane.
I think what you were saying about the criticality is really important, and it's, you know, it's embedded throughout what we should be doing. We're trained to do that through into headship as head teachers. You know, it's embedded in what we do. So I suppose my addition to that is that we have to take on board what Mark Priestley says about teacher agency and that ecological approach and apply that into what we're doing, and making sure that we are creating systems where criticality is encouraged and enabled within our schools, within our systems, you know, whatever layer that's at. It's great being a critical thinker, but unless there are the opportunities to be able to act on that, I think you end up with very frustrated critical thinkers in an environment where we can't have critical discussions leading to action. And I'm very lucky to be able to be in an environment where I can have those conversations. But I certainly know that that's not a consistent experience across the country. And I suppose that kind of consistent critical thinking and acting would be a great next step.
Lena, your reflections on that, what's your experience been?
Completely resonates there, I think, with what Douglas and Jane have said. I think recently I've sort of thought that I'm becoming my mum, because I've been in this for a long time, and I'm sort of starting to do that thing of thinking, oh no, that reform, it's the same as in the 90s, and you know, but actually I think and in a way that can be frustrating when you get a bit older and you start looking and thinking, wait a minute, nothing's changing, we're doing the same things. But I think what I've had to realize is every iteration brings something new, and it's not that it wasn't good back then, it's just that actually this time we're looking at children's mental health, we bring something new, but we learn from what went before. And I think that's what Douglas said, is we have to look at what's gone previously, take the good from the research, and you know, but human activity is about constant reform. That's what we do, you know, improvement, development, progress. But I think what Douglas also said about we need to be curious about our motives, because, you know, we're all guilty, aren't we, of saying, oh, I'll do this project in school because I'm doing into headship, or because I'm doing my master's. And I think it's about that sense of understanding ego and understanding absolutely why we are doing things as leaders. And for me, it's because, you know, in any classroom with any teacher and any combination of pupils, there's always going to be something that requires to be changed so that those children and that teacher feel safe and achieving and joyful, and it's never going to be the same twice. And I just think, you know, everything you've said there is so important. Yeah, so that's kind of my take on it, really.
Thanks, Lena. Marion, how does that translate for you?
Again, I think I would like to just kind of build on what's previously been said. In terms of reform, I think in Scotland we've got absolutely a fabulous opportunity to build on what's there, because for me it is about the values of inclusion, equity, social justice, empowerment, and I think the whole system is built on the premise of values and what it is that we're trying to do in terms of the young people in the communities that we actually serve, in terms of education being that protective space, but also that transformative space where we're trying to build the kind of society that we're looking for. I think coming at this from a community learning and development perspective, there's also something there about language. So often when we talk about education reform, we talk about school reform, when actually when you look at education in Scotland, we have got the best framework in place and the building blocks, from the Curriculum for Excellence to the Education Scotland Act to the different policies at a micro level, meso level and a macro level to actually explore that. So often the focus is just on that kind of school attainment, what's going on in school, when actually so much of our improvement is round about what goes on. The icing on the cake is so much about what goes on and with the families, the community work, and having that real dynamic between what is the lived life experience of our young people, of our families, of our adult learnings. And I think we've got real opportunity to build in that, but we have to be really clear about what aspects of education it is that we're talking about when we're reforming, and being really clear about what that means across the system. So if we mean teacher education, we mean teacher education. If we mean broader educators, make sure that it's inclusive in that way. And I think there's been huge strides and steps across Scotland for that to change and move in that direction over the last few years. So lots of opportunities I would suggest going forward.
Yeah, and language came up last night in the conversation as being a kind of key part and something that we need to keep working on. Jillian.
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess just building on that, I was struck when Douglas was talking about, as always, reform is always happening. But one of the unique opportunities I think we've got, from the pandemic is that actually our leadership practice in places is ahead of the research. So we've talked about curiosity and using the research. But I was really struck last night, for those of you who were at this session with the International Council of Education Advisors, and Alma Harris was reflecting on the role of leadership during the pandemic. And I've been really impressed by Alma's work over the last few months. But Alma herself talks about that leadership practice actually got in front of the research, because school leaders, and Marion, picking up on your point, leadership more widely across communities, there wasn't research to refer to around how you lead through a pandemic. And actually, I think our school leaders in Scotland have done an amazing job of leading through, phrases that we're overusing, but leading through a time of uncertainty that we've never known. And I think we owe a debt to our school leaders for that leadership. But in the reform part of that, linking back, then actually we all collectively as a system need to learn from that leadership who were literally leading from the front. So how do we make sure that those voices, Lindsay McRoberts yesterday was talking about her work in the IH Stretch programme and was talking about the importance of school leaders being at the table. So in terms of that reform, Douglas, how do we make sure that school leaders, and not just school leaders, are at that table and are contributing their learning, their experience to that reform? And there's a train, Sarah, I told you.
Yes,
I just wanted to absolutely agree with what Jillian was saying about sometimes, almost the system being ahead of the research, and in a unique situation like the pandemic, I think that makes absolute sense, because leadership is what you do, it's not your job title. And I think we saw some excellent examples of teachers, pupil support assistants, head teachers taking real leadership for their community during the pandemic. They were the ones chapping the doors, delivering the food, delivering the hard copy material so that kids can continue to learn. So I think we saw some outstanding leadership there. Yeah. And in the face of that, I think those of us like me, in county buildings, a mile away from the front line, should have a degree of humility. So, the leadership is there. The understanding of the change in the system throughout the pandemic is in schools. I've had a leadership role, but there has been a significant shift in the way learning and teaching takes place through the pandemic. I think we need a degree of humility in the face of that. So anyway, just to absolutely agree with Jillian, the system at times can be ahead of the reform or the leadership.
Yeah. Mark, I wonder if I can bring you in at that point. What was your experience during the pandemic, and what have you seen? What have you learned? What's changed for you?
I had a very interesting experience, because actually, although just to echo some other points, not leadership just being about a formal leadership role, and quite often people had said to me, if you want a job as a PT, you have to kind of be doing the job anyway before you start even thinking about it. But just outside, formal leadership roles, seeing the value in the leadership at different levels. But for the pandemic, personally, it was very interesting because that was actually my first step into a formal leadership role in a new school during what has been a crazy couple of years. So it's been a really steep learning curve for me, not in more ways than one. So I've been reflecting on a lot of leadership learning over the last couple of years, and then just going right back to the chalk face, as they say, and trying to put it in practice. So yeah, I think for me it's probably quite not wholly unique, but quite interesting time to step into a formal leadership role. But yeah, I think just to kind of build on what's been said already, especially in local authority I work in, we try and I know we're going to come on to this later, but working on leadership at all levels. And I think just even for, as Douglas was saying, for people in formal leadership roles to be sort of gatekeepers against reform, just off the back of that, I think there's been a real shift, and from what I've seen, especially in the last couple of years, where teachers are taking a more leadership role, especially when it comes to like the professional learning, and then they know the why of why they're doing things, and they're able to then block some changes that might be not suiting the learners or suiting the young people. And I have really seen and engaging through things like Twitter and things like this evening, just a real shift in what, professional learning is no longer something that's done to you. It's something that you're an active leader in, even if it's just for your own learning. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see that.
I think there's been such different experiences through the pandemic. I hear people saying they felt empowered and others feel disempowered by the experiences and the impact of different things on them. I'm wondering, Billy, from your perspective, what has it felt like for you? Has it felt like an empowering phase or a disempowering phase, or no different?
That's a difficult one to answer, Sarah. Many elements where, for necessary reasons, decisions have to be made away from the places, I suppose, where it affects young people in our communities. But that's been the case in life in general, not just education. But I would agree with many of the points that have been made so far. I appreciate the comment from Jillian. I think school leaders have done an outstanding job, not just at keeping things going and delivering education, or as Douglas has recognised, in looking after people. And I think, going back to your original question, leadership in these times and going forward, if we've learned nothing in the last 18 months, surely it's about that actually it's all about people. We kind of knew that, but didn't really know it. So if reform implies change, then the key message needs to be that change needs to lead to improvement. Because you can change something, you can make it worse. So as has already been referenced, let's be positive about change, because it is and should be a feature of education, because in education we're about learning, and we learn all the time, so we get new learning, therefore we need to do something with it to make things better. That's the quest that we're on. So it's about positive change. I think it's time to be bold, though. I do think that we need to be bold. We know that we do really well in Scotland. We've got lots of strengths, but we also know the system doesn't serve every young person and every family. We've got lots of issues in our society still. So, if you believe that the power of learning and education can make a difference to the world, that's probably why you're on this call on a Thursday night or tuning in whenever. It's why you've become an educator. And we need to be positive. We need to be bold. We need to recognise that position of strength we're building from, but we need to connect it back to people. And the word empowerment's come up several times already, because we know people do better from whatever position they contribute to when they feel that their contribution matters and that they have some agency and autonomy about what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to pick up on a point. I think it was you, Jillian, that maybe said this, that we need to learn more from the voices of our leaders. How might we go about that then? If we're recognising that's something we need to do, how might we go about that?
I think there's a number of ways to do it, Sarah. And I would say, before I talk maybe some examples of those, I would say that what's really important is that folk don't wait to be asked. So there's, Billy was talking there about boldness. And as a system, I think we need to be confident. And I think Jane talked earlier about being able to be critical and to challenge. And I think that's a responsibility of all leaders. So there are lots of formal ways to make sure that your voice is heard. Billy, you have a background in SLS, for example, so professional associations are a vehicle to make sure your voice is heard. But if you're working in a local authority or a school, Douglas, there are ways for school leaders to make voices heard and the authorities they work in. But I guess my plea is about not waiting until there's an ask, but feeling that there are open doors that you can go and say it. And I guess that, that applies to national organisations too. We're trying really hard. So if I use examples of, for instance, Excellence in Headship, where those programmes or the teacher leadership programme, there are two examples where actually the voices of those who are engaging in those programmes are really strong in the building of them. So those are two ways, two concrete ways to make that happen. But I do think there's a tension in the system around confidence, and I think that might be something to talk about too. So I'm really privileged to chair or co-chair with Lawrence Finlay two groups in terms of SERG recovery. One is a head teacher support group, and the other is the workforce support group. And there is real variance around confidence in speaking out, and looking to speak nationally and locally. And people give really different examples of that depending on their own experience and their own confidence. So how, in terms of leadership, do we get to a place where we have confidence as a system, no matter where we work, critique, challenge, and engage positively around collective solutions? I guess that's a really big question to throw into the mix, but I think it's really important.
So how, and you're right, there are tensions, and I think those tensions have surfaced through our various conversations. And I guess maybe it's not how do we resolve the tension, but how do we use the energy the tension brings sometimes. Marion, your thoughts?
I guess I was just going to share an example where sometimes that tension can be really helpful and really opportunistic, and that's where there's that interprofessional learning. One of the strengths that the CLD Standards Council and Education Scotland have been able to offer learners in the last year or so has been about into aspiring leadership, into middle leadership. If you're thinking about what does that look like in that space, and being able to have that real shared conversation about different pedagogies, what does it look like to work with a group of adult returners, comparing to your primary 2 class, how different does the context look? What does it look like to negotiate learning outcomes with learners? How do we swap power for influence? What about that whole social contagion of leadership? And having those professional conversations across the spaces, I think that's sometimes been a tension where we can build on the opportunity of having that difference, because essentially what we don't want is that kind of homogenous system too. We need difference in it. We need to allow that space for professional action to emerge.
Yeah, and I can see your colleagues all nodding with that as well. And it would be great to hear from those that are listening in the chat, your reflections, how might we build that confidence? What would need to be different for you to feel more confident in the system in that way? Lena?
I think everything you've said is so important, and Jillian, I think it is absolutely so important that we consider how we build confidence. And as somebody that's worked with Women Ed, a lot of the chat there is around how do we make our voices heard in a system where actually we feel maybe a bit disempowered. But I know Khadijah's not here, and I just want to say, for her, I know I was at something with her on Saturday, and sometimes, we need to consider cultural differences. We need to consider, really what voice means. I think it's really interesting if you look at the work that Kate Wall's done around the early years and how voice is many different things. It's not just about talking. It's how we communicate in so many different ways, and how can we get our introverted teachers, how can we get our quiet voices to be heard? And it's about considering what voice is and what communication is. And I do think that's really important. And it's absolutely about inclusion. It's about considering, it's just about asking why we're not hearing from some people. And we've all said leadership it's not just about the people that have that official leadership title. Some of the greatest ideas come from the people who would never consider themselves to be leaders. And actually something I thought of as well when Jillian was speaking earlier about research, and it's where we look for our ideas, because actually there is research out there about how leaders have coped in crisis before. In other parts internationally, there haven't been global pandemics, but there've been pandemics, and it's about learning, isn't it? Because we're all learners. Where can we look? Where can we go? And Sarah, I know I was in this is terrible, but it's the end of the day. I was in a fantastic session a while back with somebody, and I'm going to say it was I don't think it was John Hattie, and I'm going to say it might have been Michael Fullen, but he talks about where there's so much learning about how other communities have used, for example, online during crises. So it's just such a wealth of learning and research that we can go to, but it's how we find that and listen to it. And I'll stop talking now because I'm talking too much.
And I guess that's where our networks and our professional learning networks and our connections really come in as well. And I've just noticed that Khadija has put up her hand, so she must be here somewhere, but Khadija, I can't see you, so please feel free to come in just now.
Hi Sarah, apologies. Hi. I'm not going to dare to put my camera on in case my PC decides to shut down again. So I was following you on my phone, but I've decided to now move back to the laptop. Hopefully this will be fine. But yeah, just picking up on some of the chat there. Marion touched on it about social justice, equity. Lena, you discussed that around leadership and sense. And for me, it's always about what can diversity do in that leadership space, and that's really important, because when we look around for our leaders, whether in schools, whether in the wider education sector, we don't see leaders from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And so these are huge messages that we are giving out to our young people. These are roles that you are not going to fulfill, right? Or you are going to face many, many challenges. And I think we need to go beyond that, so to think about the influence that having a diverse leadership team would have. But also somebody mentioned about that in the chat around the distinction between leadership and management. And so many of our teachers and teachers of colour have shown real leadership over the last 18 months. We know we had COVID. We also had the killing of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Many of our teachers of colour moved into action where otherwise they might have been reluctant to bring forward that cultural wealth that they have, that they bring to their teaching to make it more culturally responsive. For fear of the implications, they were more open to doing that, to challenge our young people to begin to think about those stereotypes that often stick and label communities. And I think that was really powerful, and that's true leadership. And sometimes often, we've got talent, and it's talents under our noses, but they're not in the right roles. It's something that reminds me, because I was reading John Amiche's book about the promises of giants, and that's something that he said there, that we need to think about the roles that we have, and in terms of how can we perhaps promote some of our teachers of colour into leadership roles, so that we see that diversity of perspective, Sarah. And we see leaders who are going to influence from a systems perspective, a policy and practice perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Khadija. Please use the hand up thing, because then I'll be able to see you in the future if you want to come in. Well done for persisting and using the phone as well. Jane.
I actually don't massively want to come in off the back of that, because that was awesome. It's kind of to go back to what Lena was saying and Jillian was saying as well. I work right at the edge of the bell curve with some of the most complex children in the authority, and it's an absolute honour to be able to do that. Couldn't do it without the team. They show up every day and they just give their all for the children, as people in schools across the country do. But one of the skills that we actually train in is intensive interaction. And that is about listening to every fibre of your body, with every fibre of your body. And our de-escalation techniques are about active listening and making sure that we are listening to everything that is said and not said. And then we need to make sure that we feed that right through our whole system. It's not just the children that need to be heard at that kind of depth of level. And I think there is a space for courageous speaking out, but there's also that talent spotting element as well, that, you know, your teachers who are absolute rock stars but will never speak up in a meeting. So how do we get them opportunities to do something meaningful for them? And for the people who are willing to kind of step up, how do we get those opportunities? But yeah, to me, one of the kind of real kind of, how do we create a space at the table for people that are not confident enough to do it but have this heard? Because some of the people who I've seen that are the most talented would never take a seat at the table.
Yeah,
they'd always wait to be asked. But when they are asked, they're phenomenal. So it's about creating those spaces.
Creating those spaces, yeah.
Can I come in that point? It's really just to agree with what Jane's saying and to pick up. And there's a couple of comments from Pauline Stephen in the chat that I agree with, you know, about we need to explore where attention is.
And I think there might be actually more than just our early years team that are wanting to tap into it, if it's okay. So do you want to let me know when suits you, or?
I'm sorry, there's somebody on the telephone just chatting about early years, and you're not muted, so we can hear you.
Well, actually, no, there would only be 4.
Kirsty, can you see who that is?
Well, I know at least 1 or maybe 2.
Hopefully, Kirsty, I'll be able to see who that is. I think
on the plus side, it's a professional conversation.
No, exactly.
Oh, it's still going on.
It's not talking about, are we having mince and tatties for tea? Anyway.
Yeah.
What Pauline's saying is, you know, like about, well, I think one of the things we've talked about is culture. I think as leaders, it's our responsibility to create an ethos where people will feel enabled and empowered and willing to take risks. So I think that's an absolute responsibility we have as leaders, and not just a point.
Yes.
As that's what
she's actually wanting to come along to the training because she says it's changed quite a lot.
Or who don't know how to work.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to go through the. I can't see who it is.
Yeah, I was hoping. Well, we probably need to leave it till after the holidays, and a Monday is probably better because that's when the early years.
Okay, I am unmuted.
So anyway, so can I okay, sorry, can I leave Pauline's comments and talk about another tension in the system? Yeah. A tension in the system for me is about the urgency with which everything has to be done. I think that creates real tension. Everything has to be done yesterday because there's a political commitment to doing it. There's always a deadline, and the problem that creates is we don't do things properly. We don't take the time to consult, to get deep engagement, and we end up with half-baked solutions. So I know it's slightly different from what we've been talking about, but certainly in terms of tensions in the system, the deadlines, the unrealistic deadlines. I mean, to some extent, the pace with which the current major structural reforms, you know, like, are we going to get deep engagement, or are we going to end up with half-baked solutions? You know, the time that Ken Muir's got to come up, and Billy's one of the expert panel there, the time scales with which things have to be done create tension and potentially lead to half-baked solutions, which then need to be sorted further down the line. So in slightly different direction, but anyway.
Yeah, I think in that it's about deeply understanding the present in order to be able to plan for the future and to develop a solution or an approach that actually is relevant and effective. Moving us on slightly, do we have the energy and the creativity and the focus in the system to create the shifts that we need? I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are about. Marion, you're nodding and saying yes. Tell me more.
I think we do, because I think across Scotland, all our educators are some of the most passionate qualified, competent practitioners that I've ever had the joy of working with, you know, and I know that's not uniform. There's lots of critique, rightly so too, but I think, I mean, you know, in that kind of question, do we have the talent? Absolutely. Do we have the drive? Absolutely. Because even if we as practitioners don't, our young people do, and they make us want to move forward and they make us want to be better and building that every single time. So I suppose the short answer is yes.
Yeah. Lena, do you want to come in there?
I'll just say yes, but I do think there is the energy, definitely the creativity, but I do think we have to remember we are still in a pandemic. It hasn't stopped. And I think well-being is a really important issue at the moment. And I think that it's okay for, we've got a, you know, across the country, I think there's a lot of staff absence for good reasons. And it's okay to say to people, actually, do you know what? If you haven't got the energy just now, someone else will take the baton for a bit while you rest, because you need to come back, because we need people in this. You know, it is a marathon, not a sprint. And one of my messages, we have to look after ourselves. And if we're not feeling well, we have to take a break. And I think particularly at this time, we are still in a pandemic. So yes, creativity in, you know, shed loads, but when we're tired, we're less creative. Our brains go into, you know, a different mode of functioning. So I think it's just important to just mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know well-being has come up a number of times in different conversations. Billy.
Yeah, just build on Lena's comments. I think that's a really important thing to call out. If you're in a school or a learning centre at the moment, you'll know that we are still in the thick of it. Unfortunately, we're not near the recovery phase yet. I think that the fact that we are trying to keep things going now, there'll hopefully be no more lockdowns and home learning and all the things that we've seen in 18 months. But day and daily, people are getting ill. They're having to test, they're having to stay off. That's not just staff, that's young people. So that's just, I suppose, to echo what Douglas was saying, a word of warning to the system that very much just keeping things going at the moment is still a focus, as it has been, and that focus for the health and well-being of our communities is still a focus. That being said, as I look on screen and see some interesting things happen, I don't know if that's just my screen. That being said, I think we do need to find that energy, that reserve, to contribute to the discussion around reform, and encourage everyone to do so at a point where they can, because we need the voice of everyone who cares about education in Scotland to be heard. And I know that through the consultation process that Ken and the team are working on, that there'll be the opportunity for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Billy. Jillian, you've got your hand up as well. Do you want to come in just now?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if these are leadership challenges, a bit like Taskmaster, that have been thrown in to see if we can keep the conversation going. But it's the well-being point I want to pick up in terms of leadership. So I would totally agree. You know, my colleagues are saying, yeah, absolutely. We, you know, as a system, we've got the energy, we've got the enthusiasm, we've got the creativity, but we can't underestimate the importance of well-being. Yeah. I was in one of the sessions today, one of the sponsor sessions that the EIS were leading, and it was about teacher wellbeing. And Andrea and Pauline did a Menti right at the beginning to say, why are you here? Why have you joined this session? And it was almost everyone was highlighting that they were there to find out about how they could support others. Yeah. Which is fabulous, because we all have a responsibility to support each other, but there's a real risk, I think, for those informal, and I know in the chat we were talking about formal and informal leadership roles. Well-being of the whole profession is important. Yeah. But leaders are invested in supporting the well-being of others, and we won't be able to be energetic, creative, influential if we're burned out. Yeah. So there's and I'm quoting Andrea primarily because she started by saying self-care is not selfish. And I think that's a really, really important message for leaders across Scotland, beyond education too. Self-care isn't selfish. So actually thinking really proactively about your own well-being, our own well-being through this makes us better able to serve others. And I think that's, you know, a phrase, I wrote it in the chat, I know Alison Weatherson liked it, I wrote, to get the best of you, they don't need the exhausted you. I've used that at successive into headship conferences every single year, because I think it's really important. And the other quote that I would throw in that I use often is that resilience is not a badge that we need to wear with pride. You know, we plod on sometimes and say, you know, I'm resilient, this is great, as a leader, I'm resilient. But actually, we need to recognise that we all need that downtime and we all need a rest so that we can give that energy to the leadership that we want to see. I think it's so important right now.
Yeah, it is, and I guess it's another one of those tensions that we've chatted about, that sometimes we can say these things are important, but to feel confident in doing these things sometimes feels different. So we can say the words, but can we walk the talk as well? Which is, I guess, another thing that has come up quite a bit as well. Mark.
Just to piggyback off of Jillian's comment there, I don't know if anyone else caught at the weekend there Scott Ed 2, which was an event that was which was run on Twitter. But David Cameron at his keynote speech, there's something that really stuck out there. Had said, you know, why are we the ones that always have to be resilient? You know, teach young people about resilience, and like Jillian was saying, you know, try not to wear it as a badge of honour, but you know, we do so much work with children and young people on resilience, and we're just kind of, some people feel anyway, that we're just kind of not part of that conversation.
Yeah. And there's so much out there around well-being as well. And I'm going to do a slight plug, but Billy and I had a conversation on our podcast with Kevin Brack, who also today just posted a blog about well-being. And I think there's lots of really important central messages and clarity in what he shared as well. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that too. Khadija, you've got your hands up, so I'll bring you back in again if I can.
Thank you, Sarah. Just put my hand down there. Just on the topic of well-being, and I'm going to stop apologising for talking about diversity and ethnicity, because my good friend David Innes, who's the convener of GTCS, will always say, stop apologising for it, Khadija. So what I'm going to say here is about the well-being. Of course, over the last 18 months, the well-being and self-care, such a priority. But we also had to appreciate, again, our leaders of colour, teachers of colour, had that was exasperated even more because of the COVID, and we knew that the data that was coming through that COVID was impacting on communities of colour more so, but also then that resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Then there was all those discussions. Twitter was toxic at that time, Sarah. It was around all lives matter, and actually misunderstanding the whole purpose of Black Lives Matter. And so they actually experienced conversations in staff rooms from their fellow colleagues about all lives matter. And you know, I used to be quite naive and think, my goodness, our teachers and our leaders cannot engage in those kinds of conversations. But sadly, Sarah, they do. And it's something that we really have to face up to. We've been having discussions about how do we record racist bullying from pupils to pupils. But actually, one of our biggest focuses that we need to also think about is the racism that our teachers of colour experience on a day-to-day basis, sometimes from their colleagues, sometimes from their leaders. So there's a real thing, and Sarah, bias resides in all of us. Yeah, we're all biased in some shape or form, but we must do, as leaders, we must do everything possible to prevent them from, you know, negatively influencing our behaviours, our actions, and how we interact with people. And I think that's really key. And inclusion for me is a choice. It's a choice we make to include or to exclude. We can't do much about diversity. That's there, and it's going to continue to be more diverse. But we can, as leaders, make an active choice here. And every time I read around socially just leaders, since focus on ASN, gender, socioeconomic status, I don't see a lot coming through on race equity work. And I know that Billy and I have been involved in discussions with Ken's group around, you know, curriculum for excellence, and should it be curriculum for excellence and equity? Really, we need to start thinking about what does equity really mean? And I think probably what I'll finish on is saying here is that I put it in the chat earlier, and there's a famous American sociologist who coined the term, oh gosh, what was it again? Charles Cooley, the looking glass self. Yeah. And actually what we must start doing as leaders is beginning to think about how do I look to other people? What do people see in me as a leader? And if we want strong, ethical, caring leadership, then we need to make sure that we hear the voices of our children of colour, our teachers of colour, our families who are diverse. And that's when leadership begins to influence that space of curriculum making, of teacher agency, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question to leave people to go away and ponder on and to think about. Thanks, Khadija. Billy.
So yeah, the question is about leadership and learning from where we've been, where we are just now, and where we're going forward. So we need to ask ourselves some tough questions, but I will start this comment by just going back to what I said earlier, that I do really believe passionately that in this country we have the building blocks. There's more strength and there is more that unites us than divides us.
Yeah.
But having said that, if we ask ourselves the questions, as we've just heard, are we comfortable with the level of poverty that exists in 2021? Are we comfortable with how people with protected characteristics in all measures are welcomed into society, are represented in society? Are we comfortable with how our local communities look and feel? Are we comfortable with how our global community, how the direction of travel is going? We're in the middle of an emergency, and not just in terms of the climate, but I would suggest in many other areas too. And it's not like me to be pessimistic, because education is the way out of it, learning is the way out of it. And that connection, as Fullan puts forward, that learning and well-being are absolutely connected because it's about people.
Yeah.
And that's the call of leadership. You know, he talks about a call to arms, and it really is. And I think in Scotland we can do it, because it's not about hierarchical positions. It's not about administration and management. It's about everyone who cares, and we do care, about young people and families and social justice. And by the way, yes, we should be proud that social justice is one of the aims of our profession. Uniting and connecting, because that's all it's going to take. Because we do have a pretty strong shared purpose. We just need to connect and apply the resources and the energy and the time to the areas in the system that has the energy and the power to carry forward that change it's need. It's easy.
So, it's just that simple, really. so taking what you said there, taking Khadija's last points and picking up on what Leslie says in the chat there about there's so much to explore in so much more detail, obviously, than we can do in this 1 hour today. Thinking ahead, where do we need to be bolder and where do we need to be braver? Brave has come up in our conversations over these 3 nights, and we've already kind of touched on it in little bits, but actually thinking about this conversation moving into the next phase and into the future, where do we need to be braver? Where do we need to be bolder? And that's a question for all of my colleagues here chatting with me, but also for everybody who's listening. I'd love to see that in the chat. Where do we need to be braver and bolder? Who's going to start us off?
I'll jump in. Sorry, Marion. The tension is constantly for me. It's okay for me to be brave and bold because I've done okay and I'm pretty well paid. I need to take care of children and young people's future too, and so that's the constant tension. I want to create an ethos where people are willing to take a risk, but they need to be calculated risks that aren't going to do harm to young people's futures. You know, I remember as school was in doing a visit, and they had shifted from doing standard grade to in 1 and in 2, and it was that long ago, but it was a strategic disaster because the maths results completely bombed. It wasn't the right thing for those kids to do. And I know that's a daft practical example and it's an old one, but sometimes the decisions that we make that seem like the right thing have negative consequences. So that's the constant tension. So I want to create an ethos where people will take risks and know that, you know, the world's not going to land on them if it doesn't work out, but they're quick to fix it if it has a negative impact on children and young people's lives.
Yeah. I'll come to you, Marion, and then Jane and Lena.
I think about being brave is just learning how to say no. I think there's so many demands on the system that we constantly add to what's there, what the demands are right across the education system, and at points we should be able to say, no, we're not doing that anymore, or that needs to be dropped off, or actually that's not for a head teacher to do, that might be best sitting within the FE sector, the early year sector, community work sector, you know, and use the leaders that are round about without, you know, actually spreading what Billy was saying there about the equity of the resource, not just always using the usual suspects to build capacity across the system, but absolutely spreading that. And some of that comes from being brave and saying no. And as Douglas said, it might be easier for some people across the system to say no than it is for others, but it's been able to do that with confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marion. Jane?
I think Marion has stolen my thunder there. But to be honest, you know, what really came from what was listened to from Douglas and Marion as well is it's about leaders knowing their context and being able to tailor what happens in their school to their context or their authority or wherever, that, you know, what we are offering in our environment, whatever that may be, meets the needs of that community. And I'm saying community because to me it's the children, it's the staff, and it's the families. You know, it really is beyond teaching children in a class. It's about how we serve our communities.
Yeah. Thank you, Lena.
That was nearly me then, being on mute. I think it's really interesting. What do we need to be brave enough to do? I think something that Mark Priestley and his colleagues talked about in their blog in response to the latest OECD report was around accountability. And I think as leaders, we need to look at how we sometimes need to have those brave conversations when things need to change. But it's how we do that in a way that's compassionate and supportive. And I think, you know, the job fundamentally of every teacher in Scotland is to look at and know every pupil in front of us so that we can quietly and persistently work out what's best for every pupil. And I think as leaders, our job is to look at and know our staff really, really well so that we work, you know, persistently and quietly to support our staff in doing what they need to do, and understanding that as leaders, we do sometimes have to have the bravery to do the things that are difficult to do.
Any final thoughts, Jillian?
And I guess I picked up the comment, Sarah, from, and sorry, I don't know first name, but H. Pinner in the chat, which is really humbling, that says, as someone who isn't a leader, and I'm sure you are, is glad I have leaders like this to look to and learn from. And actually, we've got a responsibility in how we model. How we model our behaviours. So Douglas's example there, you know, modelling that calculated boldness. I was trying to think of a phrase, Douglas, I don't know if that's the right one, but calculated boldness, you know, calculated risk taking, but also we have a responsibility in making space for others. Sometimes we just need to get out of the way. But picking up on Khadijah's point, where do we make the space for others? How do we bring other people into the conversation? And how sometimes do we give a step up or a step in? And I think that's you know, I'm really humbled by that comment, but it feels to me, for us, like a call to action for this group and wider than this group.
Yeah. Thank you, Jillian, for noticing that in the chat. Khadijah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much, Jillian, for that last comment. And I think, you know, for me, it's that allyship that you've just talked about there, Julian, in the sense of using some of that power and privilege that you have to be able to then stand with and support your colleagues of colour to move into these leadership spaces where we can have some real, you know, pedagogy of possibilities. I think, you know, there's so many of them that we can think about there. And for me, if we're thinking about what next, really, whenever I do work around race equity, and we just have to look, I mean, Scottish Government are been really committed over the last 8-9 months around this. And we have the race equality framework where our leaders can dip into, and so on, particularly the section of, in education, where our leaders need to be interculturally competent. Yeah. And some might ask, what does that mean? But actually what we want to try and say to our young people is that it shouldn't take us another decade up until 2030, as it stipulates in the framework. How do we explain to young people that they might need to wait another 10, 15 years before what I would argue their basic human rights are upheld? Because that's what it comes down to, children's rights, the right to participate within a curriculum that speaks to them, the right to participate in the sense where their teachers can pronounce, and this is very, very basic, Sarah, to get the pronunciation of their names correct. That's a central part of our identity. And oftentimes young people, their names are anglicised or changed. Yeah. And I think, my goodness, we need to encourage our young people to bring their whole selves in, those diverse, multiple identities into schools, into our classrooms, and also our educators of colour. So it's really important for us to think about that in terms of leadership roles. Yeah. And again, it reminds me of the famous words of James Baldwin when he said, what is it you want us to reconcile to? Because, I was born 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. But, it's taken, my time, my parents' time, my kids' time. How much time do we need to see progress? How long do we have to wait to see this change and this shift within our leadership, within educational settings?
Thank you, Khadija. I think that's the perfect way to finish things tonight, with a really bold invitation there. And I think the words allyship, as Jillian has picked out as well, is a great. Although calculated boldness was not bad either, Jillian. Both are good. Both are good. It is just, I'm 1 minute late. I've been on time all week and I'm late tonight, but thank you firstly to my colleagues for joining me, for participating in this conversation, for your honesty, for your challenge and your energy. Thank you to all of those of you who have joined and listened at the end of what I'm sure has been a busy day. Oh, we can see you, Khadija. A busy week, I'm sure, as well. And I really look forward just to seeing how these conversations continue to grow and evolve in this next phase of Scottish education. I hope, if you're going on to enjoy the next keynote, I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have a lovely evening after that. And just thank you very much. So thank you. And we have to wave because it's obligatory.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right, take care.